Hugh Sprowson. How you doing today, sir?
I'm very good, Joey. How are you?
I'm doing all right, Hugh. I want to know this. We had a chance to catch up quickly before this, and I have to know if you had to pick the best 1-2 sort of debut follow-up albums of any band, who has the best 1-2 kind of offering to start their career?
Well, I think that's an easy one for me. I'm going to have to go with Oasis. It was a
All
very
right.
formative part of my life, kind of when Be Here Now and Definitely Maybe came out, and I just thought it was a sound unlike nothing I'd ever heard. And as you know from our conversation last week, I'm in a band now, and we're trying to recreate some version of that sound ourselves. So I'd have to go with that one.
Okay, I'm a big Oasis fan myself. Also, I think in those formative years, I was in elementary school, junior high, just kind of singing "Don't Look Back in Anger" to myself. If you had to pick a track, what's the track? What's the number one go-to Oasis track?
Yeah, I have to say probably that one, just from the reaction we get from the crowd when we play it. I mean,
Nice.
our last gig was 250 people, and we had everyone singing along, and it's just an awesome feeling. It's just an awesome feeling.
Is there any part of you that is slightly devastated that they will probably never make music again together?
That's an interesting one, isn't it? But I suppose with bands, there's plenty of examples of bands going on too long and kind of losing their mojo. And I just think maybe if you can make, I know they went on longer than 2 albums, but if you can make 2 really, really great albums and perhaps not extend your popularity too long belong that it's better to leave a legacy like that than kind of just carry on ad infinitum and maybe lose what made you unique in the first place. So yeah, it is kind of a shame, but I mean you've got volatile personalities in any environment. I guess at some point things are going to blow up potentially.
Yes, I mean we could consider it a commercial crime that they have not, released any more, material. But let's talk about something that is, I guess, maybe more serious, a little more adult, a little more grown up.
Sure.
Hugh, what is going on in the world of commercial crime? What are you seeing? What is happening there? And where do you think agents need to be kind of paying attention?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting time, not just in the commercial crime space, although that's obviously what we'll specifically talk about, but just in the insurance market in general. I mean, I've been in the Lloyd's market now for 20 years and the industry for 25 years, and I can honestly say I've never seen volatility and market change like it. And I think obviously the main driver of that at the moment is the COVID pandemic, and commercial crime, I don't think is exempt from the effects of that at all. In fact, I think it's affected that particular segment of the market perhaps in ways that maybe agents and indeed the clients are maybe not quite understanding or only starting to understand. We're seeing a lot more inquiries in this space, and actually I'm surprised we're not seeing more. One thing we notice in times of duress is that there's always an expectation that crime, or at least attempts on crime, will increase. That can come from multiple directions, and I think this is either what businesses are facing or will discover they're facing, because sometimes fraud and crime can take its time to work its way through the system and be discovered. First of all, there's the increased moral hazard of your staff. Now, we still believe that fidelity losses, as we call it in the trade, or employee dishonesty is still probably the single most prevalent factor in the losses that we see in this space. And when you have an environment in which obviously there have been, unfortunately, job losses and just a general kind of feeling that maybe jobs aren't as secure as they once were, clearly that creates an environment in which people might be tempted to commit an act of dishonesty. It may be driven by desperation. It may be driven by all sorts of things. Some people commit fraud just because they perceive it to be a way of getting money illegally. But I think some people do it to try and support their family if they're in tough straits. It could be all sorts of things. Gambling problems we see. There's all kind of things going on in people's lives that as an employer you probably wouldn't know. That's one aspect where we see the moral hazard of employees working within the businesses themselves perhaps being tempted during this particular time of upheaval. But also I think particularly where we've got businesses that have had to move to remote working. None of us, or a lot of us anyway, have not tested this process before. it's a challenge to see how systems are going to respond to that. I think some industries, perhaps like the insurance industry and other financial services industries, were perhaps more prepared and better set up for it. But sometimes that creates dislocation in your systems. And again, one of the things we always look at is whether there's certain controls and procedures in place, particularly over things like check signing and payment instructions. And those are being challenged in a remote working environment. It's easy enough to do when you're sitting in the same office and you can get forms signed by a colleague who works on the next desk or down the hall. But clearly when you're working remotely, that's not possible. And I think fraudsters are well aware of that and they will seek to take advantage. I think in the current climate, there is an increased risk. I think there is, as I say, this very febrile environment created specifically by COVID. And I think that will undoubtedly mean that businesses at this point in time are more susceptible to a crime, a theft, a forgery, a fraud, a cyber event than perhaps was the case at other times. So it's definitely a risk that I think businesses should be considering. I think it's a very critical risk to a lot of businesses. I'm not sure it's one that they always place at the top of their agenda, but I guess if I can put one message over today, it's maybe that perhaps it should be.
Well, you mentioned that it sometimes takes time for the crime to filter its way through the business. Do you have any sort of average amount of time that it takes for once a crime is kind of started within the business to where it actually surfaces?
I mean, clearly for the more basic physical losses, if some stock gets stolen or there's a cash theft, I mean, clearly that's discovered fairly quickly. But I think the more complex frauds, particularly one where employees are, at the end of the day, and I hate to go back to it, I'm not accusing all employees of being fraudulent actors by any means, but they tend to be the ones who not only know how best to extract money illegally from the business, but also how to cover it up. And I would say commonly for the larger frauds, you could easily be talking 2-3 years for something to eventually come to light. And often, I mean, it sounds really, really strange. One of the questions we will always ask, and it's tough in the US because of labour laws, is whether employees are taking their vacation allowance every year. And sometimes people look a bit askance at us and wonder why we're so concerned about whether employees are taking vacation or not. But still, I think the most common way that these frauds are discovered is when somebody has to leave the business either for vacation or for other reasons. Someone else has to take over their position and they find that there's been some suspicious activity going on. So that's the reason we ask. And I think, again, if the practice of the business is not to enforce that rule and not to insist on that happening, then sometimes it can take a long time. I mean, we've seen 15, 20 years of systemic theft going on, but remained undetected all that time.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. You don't want to. So I guess I always wondered why they stress taking vacation. Now I know you had actually never put two and two together, but there's actually a reason for it outside of wanting you to recharge your batteries. They just want to double check everything.
Right. And I think, there are various question sets like in all classes of business that we ask. And as I say, that is one of the standard questions. It's tough in the US because unlike in this country where we get a considerable allowance of vacation, the US standard seems to be 10 days, of which 5 days tends to get taken at one time. Although you do stock up on public holidays a lot more than we do. I have noticed that.
Well, you got to make up for it somewhere, right, Hugh?
I guess.
Well, let me ask you this, though. You had mentioned it not being at the top of the list. What do you think is preventing that sort of awareness into it being, sort of much more higher priority for businesses than it is?
Well, I don't know. And again, I think maybe this is the job of the agents out there. I mean, I think businesses, I think especially in these current straitened times, it's all about cost and what they perceive they will get back for that cost. And I do understand that the premium we charge for this product will only add to that cost. But your assets as a business, as well as your people, if you're a retail outlet and you've got stock in warehouses, that's an asset to you. That's something you want to sell to generate revenue. And if that was stolen, that's money coming out of your pocket. And I think often people will think about the physical side of damage, flood and fire and that kind of risk. But, if someone gets in a lorry full of mobile phones or iPads and drives off with that could be considerably more devastating than a small fire. I think maybe it's just a matter of perception. I think sometimes clients are driven down the road of, I'll only buy what I have to buy, whether that's statutory or whatever it might be to protect my employees. I think you have to look at what such an event could do to your business and the damage it may cause. And sadly, what we see a lot of the time, we only have people coming to us and applying for this insurance when the problem's already happened. And of course, as a buyer, that is the worst position you can possibly be in. You're now submitting an application with a theft or a fraud or whatever it might be on your record, and clearly you're then not going to see the benefit of a premium and a retention level that you would have done had you taken the action to buy the policy before the event. I guess it's one of those things where it depends what's important to you. It depends how your priorities sit in terms of protecting your assets. But at the end of the day, my view would be that a commercial crime policy significantly protects your assets. At the end of the day, that is what generates value for your business. So I really see a major value in this product. And whilst we don't tend to see the huge losses perhaps that are generated more on the financial services side of the book that we have, nevertheless, a lot of the commercial entities that buy the crime products are much smaller, so they're much less able to withstand the fraud or the problem when it comes along.
That's another aspect of, we're kind of conditioned to buy the things that we can see and touch and kind of have a little more tangibility to them. And that's the other thing, like fascination about, people being obsessed with buying the coverage that they might actually be less likely to actually have a claim on. What's the sort of frequency at which a business might be at risk for some type of, fraudulent event or something like that?
I mean, it's really hard to say because clearly some businesses are going to be more susceptible than others. I mean, depending on their size and the type of industry that they're in. I'm going to sort of answer that question in a roundabout way because one of the phenomenons that we've seen in the past 5 years is the advent of what's been termed social engineering fraud. I don't actually like that term at all because I think it's extremely misleading. But let's call it fraudulent payment instructions. This is something that simply wasn't around 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, we write a fairly large book of title and escrow businesses in the US, and that was where we first became aware of it in 2015. The real estate industry and the escrow industry were I think I can safely use the word ambushed by social engineering, which really had never come across anyone's radar before. And as with all these things, it proliferated outwards into other areas of the economy. And I can pretty safely say that just about any industry you want to talk about was either at risk of this happening or it did actually happen to them across financial services, education sector, healthcare. I mean, it was absolutely rife and it's still going on today. I just think that's probably one example of this kind of idea of, well, and we hear this all the time, well, it will never happen to us. It will never happen to us because we know the people we deal with. Our director signs every check and it's not enough, Joey. I mean, we've seen it, I'm sure you do know all your vendors. I'm sure you do know all your counterparties, but these fraudsters are so clever. I mean, I have seen some of the email sort of traffic between a business and the fraudster before the loss happens. And it's actually quite scary in some ways. I mean, they've clearly sat on the email for a time and watched conversations go on so that when they actually forward the fraudulent email, there's some really personal stuff in there sometimes about maybe your football team or your daughter's name, or did you go to that gig at the weekend? They put all this stuff in to make it look very genuine. People are duped all the time. I think partly because people by nature are trusting. I think in the escrow industry, I think now there's a massive awareness of it. I think the training has been really good. I think the whole industry mobilised in the same way as in the financial services sector. But I still don't think that's the case for small businesses. I still think they don't have the systems and the checks and balances and the controls to fight this in a way that perhaps other industries can throw resources behind it. And I still think they're very susceptible to this kind of fraud. And we see it happen all the time. And maybe it's only $10,000, maybe it's only $15,000, which to a larger business would not be a lot, but to a small, mom and pop type shop, that's a lot of money. Sometimes that's precisely the reason the fraudsters will target them, because They rely on the fact that there's only one or two people really taking control of transactions, and therefore there is less eyes scrutinising the transaction when it goes through. I think that's another reason why, we afford social engineering cover within our forms. And I think that's one specific example of where our industry has responded to a global problem.
Yeah, so I mean, would you say that that's probably the number one sort of threat that, businesses, maybe small businesses, kind of are at risk for these days, is that type of deception kind of around payment?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, going back to what I said before, I mean, I still think employee fraud, generally speaking, I would always say is the biggest cause of loss, the most frequent cause of loss. But if you're talking about frauds perpetrated on a business by third parties, yeah, I would absolutely say that is probably number one at the top of the risk register at this point in time.
So I'm kind of curious, where you would define, this policy and another sort of popular new policy, cyber. Where do you kind of see these kind of passing the baton? Where does one stop? Where does one begin? Where do they overlap? What's because they're often sort of lumped in together, but yet they serve very different things.
In my head, the distinction was always very clear. I've been in the on the financial line side of the market for a number of years, and actually in our bond forms we always gave cyber coverage, except nobody called it that then because that wasn't a cool word to bandy around. So, but we called it computer fraud, and that's been around since the 70s or 80s. But I think the distinction, as I say, in my head was very clear. The crime market was set up to cover physical assets. And I think that's money, securities, stock in the case of small businesses or even medium-sized businesses. And the cyber market was always set up to cover data. It was the intangible assets that may be held by a business, maybe on their computer servers. But we never covered things like loss of personal data. We never covered business interruption. So I suppose if I put it in a nutshell, I would say tangible versus intangible, but there is a crossover because we would give cover for intangible. Clearly, a lot of people now hold money and securities in electronic form. So if it was an intangible asset, but that still had a monetary or a fiat value, then I think that could fall to be considered under a crime policy. But as I say, generally speaking, for me, the distinction is property and money versus data. And that really was where the distinction should fall. Now, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of blurring of lines, and we do see crossover, and social engineering is a perfect example of that. I still don't think the cyber market and the crime market can agree on who should be covering that, and you will see it in both forms. They approach it in a slightly different way, and I think the crime market generally will give higher limits than the cyber market in the majority of the time. But again, it just goes to show that there is still some crossover, and there is some disagreement as to where a loss should fall. I mean, personally, I don't think social engineering is a cyber loss at all. I think it is a manipulation of people to act in a certain way. Just because the instruction has come in via email, that does not make it a cyber loss. A cyber loss to me is where someone has maliciously attacked your computer system, hacked in, done damage, stolen data. That's not what happens on a social engineering loss. It's manipulation of people and duping them into surrendering money away when on a fraudulent basis.
So now, if you're kind of in the agent's shoes here, is this a conversation that you would try to create separation between the two products, or try to have a conversation kind of with both of them at the same time, understand, kind of breaking down those differences and where they matter, or do you think it's easier to kind of keep them separate?
I would always advocate keeping them separate because I think we'd have to look at the policy form in question, but I think if you have well-written products on both sides, I think that distinction is quite easy to achieve. And I do think the cyber policy will afford very important coverage to a business that the crime policy does not. I'm not a cyber underwriter, but I always advocate buying that product now because I think it's established. That market is now very established. It's generally quite affordable. And again, I think for a lot of businesses that is a considerable risk that they are running in terms of cyber fraud and attempts at cyber fraud. Because again, I think the more we've moved, particularly when you look at businesses that have moved into online trading, contactless cards, card not present transactions, there's an awful lot of business now being done offline, if you like, or at least through the electronic channels that didn't exist again 20, 25 years ago. So I think there is clear need as well for, we're storing more and more data within our systems, and therefore I think cyber is an important product. But I do think there is a distinction. As I say, I think the agent clearly needs to make sure that he's happy that distinction does exist, and if it's not, we're quite happy to tailor coverage accordingly.
If you had to give an agent your sort of best line for somebody that maybe isn't as familiar selling the coverage, but they want to maybe start making it a part of the regular conversation, what's sort of your best line that they could kind of give off to their clients to sort of justify the coverage? Like, if you put a little proper, English spin on it too, if you want.
Well, that's a good question. I hadn't prepared for that one, Joey. So you've slightly thrown me for a loop there. But I guess the problem is always close to home. The number of times where we've seen long-standing and supposedly very loyal employees who've turned out to be completely the opposite is staggering. It's distressing for the businesses. It's distressing for the employer. I think you can never, whilst clearly you have to operate in an environment where you trust your employees to do a good job, I think you also have to have the controls around that to help them kind of not be tempted, really, because, as I say, the problem is that anybody can get into circumstances that leads them down a dark path. And as I say, the one thing for me is the problem is always close to home, and the potential problem is always close to home. You can never be too careful when you're talking about protecting your own assets, and sometimes you have to protect those assets from people close to you. And it's a tough thing to think about sometimes, but that at the end of the day, I mean, I reckon if I had to put a number on it, 75, 80% of the fraud we see all either emanates from an employee or it's the employee themselves. They either enable the theft or they commit it themselves. And it's tough. I don't take any pleasure in saying that, but I think that probably would be the message, is just don't assume everything's okay because you work with people a long time. You have to look close to home and make sure you're happy with what you've got. But as I said before, this is a major mitigation against the risk to your assets. There is an increasing prevalence of fraud and cyber fraud and social engineering, and we are seeing it all the time. And I just don't think you can ever assume you're immune from it, because at some point you won't be.
Well, prepared or not, Hugh, I think you pulled it off nicely. Here, I get two more questions for you. And the first one, I kind of want to know where you're most excited about. You've been doing it a long time. This type of coverage is kind of ever evolving, like you said, with the new sort of social engineering threat. But where do you think there is the most potential? What do you see coming around the corner that kind of has you excited? Well,
we're really excited about opportunities in the US right now. We've never had the ability or the distribution really to get involved with the SME sector, which is that's really our bread and butter. That's the industry environment that we like to trade with. So we're just gearing up now to really market ourselves to that segment, because I still think, as I said, there's a lot of opportunity to market this product to business owners who still probably are not au fait with the product and perhaps still thinking this isn't necessarily something they need. And as I say, I think COVID in a way provides maybe the stimulus and the catalyst to do that, because whilst I understand that businesses have other concerns right now, I think equally one has to think that the last thing they can equally afford is a large fraud. So we perceive our product to be helping those businesses become more robust as they come through this problem. I think around the world, though, it's always exciting in other regions who are perhaps behind the buying curve compared to the US and the UK, where perhaps, I always say the US, our clients are great believers in insurance as a risk mitigation tool and always have been. So, selling in the US is perhaps less challenging as long as you've got a product and a kind of ethos that works. But it's really exciting seeing other regions of the world starting to understand the value in the products we offer as well. So whilst I love coming to the US and I enjoy trading with my US friends and clients enormously, it's also really cool to see other developing regions also starting to appreciate that they can mitigate their loss by engaging with us and buying our products too. And as you say, it's always evolving. I might be looking at something in the US this week, Romania next week, Australia the week after. Africa's and the Middle East are big developing regions too. So there's always something going on.
All right, Hugh, last question to you, sir. If I were to be able to grant you the power to change one thing in the insurance industry, it doesn't really matter where, it doesn't have to be commercial crime related, but if it's one thing anywhere, what's the thing that you're changing and what they're doing?
I'll tell you what, there's an awful lot of questions. There's an awful lot of answers I could give to that question, but I'm not sure it would make the final cut. What would I change? I think I'm going to say this in as diplomatic as fashion as I possibly can. I would probably try and eradicate what we might euphemistically call red tape, because I still think in a lot of ways our industry is very old-fashioned. And what I've actually really appreciated about the lockdown, and you know, as you well know, in London we do the whole face-to-face trading thing, and I've always got a lot out of that. You know, I've made a lot of very valuable relationships, and it's been a wonderful thing. But we never thought that remote trading and operating, working from home would really work, because perhaps we were all a little bit fearful of changing our modus operandus. But actually, it has worked brilliantly. You know, we've all responded to the challenge. I think it's response times are actually much shorter. We've all embraced electronic trading in a way that everyone was very reluctant to do before. And I just think we've got so much wonderful technology out there. You know, we're all utilising Zoom all of a sudden. You know, there's so much technology we could embrace. I just think we could make our lives so much easier, so much more streamlined, and so much easier for clients and agents and everybody else if we could just find a way to kind of let our guard down a little bit more and embrace it. Because I think there's still too much kind of concern and fear that we'll lose our unique selling point if we're all sort of not working from home all the time, but just if we go away from those more traditional ways of doing business. And like anybody else, you know, to survive, our industry has to evolve. I would just like to see the kind of dropping of the reticence to embrace some of the new technology that's been afforded to us, and moving forward and making our business cleaner, simpler, faster, and everything else that goes with it.
This has been fantastic. I'm going to leave it right there, sir.
All right. Thanks, Joey. It's great to speak to you, and have a great week.